What's up, guys? So in this video, I'm going to break down the IP method. This is the system that I've been using to make steroid-like progress to my physique without actually taking steroids. And what I mean by that is literally waking up each day to countless steroid accusations. People asking me what gear I'm taking, what peptide I'm running. It goes without saying that I am completely natural, and I attribute all of the progress that I've made over the last 4 years or so to the system that I've had in place to get myself from a position where I genuinely had no idea how to progress, knowing that progressive overload was important and necessary for me to progress, but just not being able to do it, to where I am now, where progression is quite literally just automatic. This video is going to be quite detailed. I'm not leaving anything out. So what I need you to do is have a notebook open in front of you. I need you to pay attention. I need you to look at the screen. Don't just have this playing in your ears. Take notes throughout, because then you can actually go ahead and apply the principles of the IP method and make the same progression that I am currently making. Now, obviously, it goes without saying that before I started lifting, I was not genetically blessed. I was very, very skinny. I spent the majority of my childhood underweight. I was medically diagnosed with anorexia at a period of time when I was about 16 years old. And I always hated how skinny I was. Always hated it. I am not predisposed to being a muscular guy, okay? You can see this in the photo, right? And when I took this all seriously, when I started to actually start training in the gym consistently, and I really wanted to change myself, that was back in 2020. And all I really did was just train very hard. I did what a lot of guys do. I went to the gym pretty much every single day because I cared that much. I trained every single set to failure. I was eating a ton of protein, a ton of calories. And look, I gained a substantial amount of muscle. You can see it in the pictures here. I clearly looked very different to how I started. And I gained a lot of muscle. But it got to this point where I simply wasn't able to progress anymore. I knew I needed to progress, but I just wasn't able to do it because every single time I tried to increase the weight on all of my exercises, it was just physically impossible. And I had no idea what to do. I had no idea how to fix this. And the objective I have for this video is simply to bridge the gap between where you are right now to a state where progression is just automatic and guaranteed. So you already know what progressive overload is. You don't need anyone else to explain this to you. You know that it is a necessity for growth to occur. And this doesn't matter if you're a complete beginner or if you've got multiple decades of training experience under your belt. Everyone needs to be progressively overloading in order to grow new muscle or in order to grow new strength. The problem is that if you don't set the conditions for progressive overload to occur, it's going to get to a point where it's no longer possible. And this is a really common scenario for most guys to end up in. After they've gained their first 6 to 12 months of muscle, it gets to the point where progressive overload stops being sustainable. And unless you're setting up the conditions properly for it to occur, it becomes increasingly more and more difficult. And the position that most guys will get into is where they start to hit plateaus, their strength level starts to stagnate, and your ability to continually increase the weight on the bar and your ability to continue squeezing more reps out of the same weight becomes harder and harder to do. And you end up in this position where you don't really know how to actually increase the weight on the bar because it's not actually possible. You don't have the strength to do it. And this is not a nice position to be in because when you're not making progress, when you're not getting stronger, you're not growing muscle. I'm sorry to break it to you if you weren't aware of this already, but if you're simply going into the gym and you're lifting the same weights that you were lifting multiple weeks ago, you're not growing from this. Now, if you watch until the end of this video, I'm going to show you exactly what to do once you get to this point here, where regardless of your genetics, regardless of your natty status, regardless of how long you've been training for, I'm going to show you how to get to a point where your strength and your muscle mass and your ability to progress is continuous and predictable, and you have a system in place that makes all of this inevitable. So to preface the rest of this video, your entire physique is controlled by your ability to perform and progress on each of the 6 fundamental movement patterns. That is horizontal pull, horizontal press, squat, vertical press, hinge, and vertical pull. And if you can gain control over your ability to progress on each movement pattern, you now have total control over how your physique looks. And what I want you to do is think of each movement pattern as a skill that you can invest points into. The system that I'm going to show you in this video will guarantee progress on each one. But to make this very simple, if there is one specific movement pattern that you are lacking progress in, you can simply focus on just one of these for now. It doesn't have to be all 6 at the same time. And if you're completely new to the system, it might make more sense for you simply just to focus on your weakest movement pattern to begin with, and then start to apply the principles over to the other movement patterns that you have here. So just to give you an example, if you wanted to grow your lats, or your back muscles in general, if you generally want to grow a bigger back, you need to gain control over your ability to progress on your vertical pulls and your horizontal pulls, and maybe even your hinge as well. If you wanted to gain control over the size of your legs, if you want to add mass to your quads, then you need to be able to develop your performance and your progression on the squat movement pattern. This is fundamental to the rest of the system, so it's worth going through. But once you understand this, it's going to be so easy for you to make progress. And for each movement pattern, there are a countless number of different exercises, different exercise variations that you can use that still fall under the same movement pattern. So an example of a horizontal pull could be a barbell row, but it could be any type of rowing movement, anything where you're pulling horizontally. A good example of a horizontal press might be an incline press, or a chest press, or a barbell bench press. Really simple stuff, but it all comes under the same fundamental horizontal press movement pattern. And there are, like I say, an infinite number of exercises that you can select. What we'll do later on in the video is go through the decision-making process that you should use when deciding which specific exercises to select that are going to help you to advance the movement pattern. Because at its core, your one single objective is to make sure that each of these movement patterns is continuously progressing. The methods that you use to do that is going to be different for different people. There are going to be some exercises that are really good for one person, but not the best for someone else. And it's your job and your objective to figure out which exercises and which variations are going to help you to progress most at the fundamental movement pattern level. Now, every exercise that you do has what I refer to as a life cycle attached to it. And this is basically the duration in which you're able to continuously apply progressive overload. So you might be able to add reps to your sets week to week. You might be able to increase the weight on the bar week to week. That would be an example of you applying progressive overload, making progress. And as a result of that, you're going to be growing muscle. You're going to be gaining strength. That is the ultimate goal. That is the objective. And the longer you can do that for, the more beneficial that exercise is to you, the more productive it is, and the longer the life cycle is. Now, it is inevitable that eventually you're going to reach a point where your ability to continue progressing either slows down or stops entirely. Okay. And what that indicates is that the life cycle of that exercise has ended. It is no longer productive. It is no longer benefiting you. It's no longer serving your goals. And continuing to train after this point here is basically worthless. It's not serving you. The reason you see so many guys in your gym who look exactly the same, the reason why most of them will never hit their full potential, the reason why you have guys in your gym who apparently train hard, but are still lifting the exact same weights as they were lifting 3 to 6 months ago, the reason for all of this is because most guys don't know what to do when they get to this point. They don't have a system in place that shows the next part of the process. And in the next few slides, I'm going to show you exactly what to do and exactly how to avoid this scenario entirely. So you can basically make infinite progression regardless of how long you've trained for. I'm going to show you the exact system that I've used to systemize my progression in the gym so that you never plateau again. So if we understand what an exercise life cycle is, and we understand that in order for you to continually be growing muscle and to continually be progressing and yielding some sort of result, you need to be staying in this first portion of the life cycle where things are green, where you're gaining strength, where you're able to apply progressive overload, then all that we really need to do is figure out when and what stimulus to use to actually continue this process of progression. Because knowing that the exercise is eventually going to die, knowing that every exercise has a limited amount of time on it before it no longer yields you results, before it dies, before the exercise life cycle ends, knowing all of that, all that we need to do is intervene at just the right moment, just before you hit that plateau, to then deliver a new stimulus, to then stimulate the muscles again in a new way and continue this process of progression. So once you get to that point where the exercise variation that you've been using has slowly stopped progressing and the life cycle of that exercise has come to an end, you can then swap it to a new variation that is going to stimulate your muscles in a very slightly different way, and it's going to propel you forwards even more. Now, bear in mind, all of the variations that you are picking need to come under the same movement pattern. It's really important that you remember what we spoke about here, about the 6 fundamental movement patterns. Each variation that you pick will come under the same movement pattern. So for example, you might have 3 different variations of squat that you can cycle between. You might have front squats, back squats, and let's say goblet squats, for example. They are all squats. They are all fundamentally a squat movement pattern, but they're all going to train your quads and your glutes in a very slightly different way. And because they are new and because they are novel, they are going to stimulate the muscles in a way that enables you to continue growing. So coming back to this, again, all 3 of these variations are within the same movement pattern. And every time you swap to a new variation, you are going to stimulate the same muscle groups in a very slightly different way, which is going to elicit more growth. And every time you swap to a new variation, if you've done this properly, and I'll show you how to progress on each one, if you do this properly, you're going to end up carrying over any of the strength adaptations that you made from the previous variation to the next variation in the cycle. Now, when you get to the end of an exercise life cycle and it's time to now move on to the next variation, the decision-making process that you now enter into should be based on whatever weak point the previous variation exposed. And I'll give you an example. You're doing bench press. That's your first variation. Standard flat bench press. You were finding that every time you failed a set, it was at the lockout portion. If you know that your triceps are the one muscle group that are holding back your progression on your horizontal press, then you can select a new variation that is going to train that weak point. You could choose a variation like a close grip bench press, which is going to be more tricep dominant. And then what you'll be able to do is carry over all of the strength adaptations you made from your flat bench. You're going to be able to carry those strength adaptations over to your close grip bench. And then when you're finished with close grip bench and you've built some more mass in your triceps, you've built strength in your lockout portion, and you've been able to train that weak point properly and gain strength on it, you're then going to be able to carry that strength over to the next variation that you pick. Now, you can start with 2 variations, you can start with 3, you can choose as many as 5 variations. What I recommend that you do is stick to 2 variations to begin with. If you've never used this system before, just start with 2 variations. And the longer that you train for, the more weak points that you're going to be able to expose, and the better your decision-making process is going to be. Now, over enough time of you doing this, and selecting the correct variations that are actually going to train the weak points that are holding back the fundamental movement pattern at the top, and through you carrying over these strength adaptations that you make from exercise variation to exercise variation, what you're eventually going to be able to do is deploy those strength adaptations that you made over the last weeks or months of training to the original variation that you started with. And despite the fact that you've not even trained it, you're now starting in a much more advantaged position, because any of the weak points that you exposed from training the original variation at the beginning, you have now fixed. So that tricep weakness that was preventing you from locking out your bench press has now been fixed. Not only are you starting that variation at a stronger level, but your strength potential also goes up as well. And you can basically just repeat this process indefinitely. Once you can find a good few variations that work really well for you, where the life cycles of each variation is nice and long, and you have a good opportunity to build enough muscle and enough strength and enough adaptation to then carry over to the next variation in that rotation, that is the best position you can be in, because you can then start to run this on complete autopilot. You don't really have to think too much about what to do and when to make these decisions, because everything is auto-regulated. So anytime you start a new exercise variation, you need to have some kind of progression model that you can use to make progress with the exercise. And the one that I prefer to use within the context of this system is by simply increasing the load at a very steady rate every single week. Now, the way that this works is that you need to start the life cycle with the highest number of reps that you can get away with. In this example, we're just going to say 12 reps. The specific number that you use is going to be based on how long you've been training for. It's going to depend on your personal preference. But for this example, I'm just going to use 12 reps. So you start your exercise life cycle with 12 reps, and you're going to steadily increase the weight on the bar or increase the load on the exercise steadily every single week. But ideally, it's going to be the smallest increment that you can manage. And over time, naturally, your reps are going to fall down. That's normal, okay? But the longer you can maintain those high reps for, the better. If you can maintain the same number of reps while still increasing the load, then that means that you are making progress. You are able to apply progressive overload, but it will eventually get to the point where your reps fall down so low that it's not going to be sustainable for you to continue adding weight. And you can tell at that point there that the life cycle of the exercise has ended. Now, the best case scenario is where you are adding weight to the bar and your reps aren't falling down. That is the best position that you can be in, and there is no need to change anything. You can keep ripping that variation for as long as you continue progressing with it. But what is more likely is that eventually your reps are naturally going to fall down. How long it takes for that to happen is going to depend on the specific variation, and it's also going to depend on the person that's training with that variation. However, again, as we mentioned with the life cycles, the longer you can keep this up for, the better and the more progress that you make. Eventually, it's going to get to a point where you're no longer able to do enough reps for the exercise to really be beneficial to you anymore. That specific number is going to depend on the person. It's going to depend on your preferences. If you don't like training with low reps, then that's going to look very different to someone who likes training with low reps or is able to do that without getting injured. For this specific example, all that we're going to do is assume that you started with 12 reps and you ended with about 6 reps. That was when the life cycle ended. You didn't want to go any heavier than that, so you called it there. That said, over that entire duration, even though you've lost 6 reps on your sets, even though at the beginning of the life cycle you were performing sets of 12, and at the end of the life cycle you were only performing sets of 6, you've still added 20 pounds to the exercise. And again, these specific numbers, they are just placeholder. Don't get too fixated on them. They are just there to demonstrate how much strength you might expect to gain and how many reps you might expect to lose over the course of the life cycle. So beyond tracking the day-to-day metrics that you would normally, like your sets, your reps, and your weight that you've used, you're going to track two more things. This is going to be the duration of the life cycle. So the duration of you going from 12 reps to 6 reps, the upper end of the rep range to the lower end of the rep range, and the amount of strength that you gained over the course of that life cycle. So in this example, we can say that we have gained 20 pounds on the exercise, and it took 8 weeks to do this. And over time, you're going to build a roster of about 12 to 18 different variations that you can cycle in and out of your training that you know are beneficial because you've tracked this. You know that they are going to yield you results. You know that the life cycles of these variations are longer and that you like training them and you're able to make progress. You're able to actually stimulate your muscles enough to advance these 6 fundamental movement patterns. So you'll have a few different variations for your horizontal pull. You'll have a few different variations for your horizontal press, and you can see every time that you run these variations, how long the life cycle lasted for and how much strength you gained within that life cycle. The longer the life cycle and the more strength you gain, the better that variation is and the more beneficial it is going to be to you to then cycle that back into your training. And so at its core, you are going to have some objectives to your training. You're going to want to grow a specific muscle group. You're going to want to overcome a specific plateau or develop a specific skill. And as long as you know what your objectives actually are, you can then select variations that are going to help you to achieve that. So if your goal was to develop a specific muscle group, let's say you're trying to grow your chest, knowing that you need to advance your horizontal pressing movements in order to get that bigger chest, then you know that you need to invest those points into developing your horizontal press. And you're going to be able to select movements, select variations that you know because you've tracked it and because you have the data to go off of, you're going to have a few different variations that you can use to advance that horizontal press movement pattern. Now, a perfect example of this system working really, really well was with my pull-ups and my vertical pull movement pattern. As soon as I picked a few incredibly good variations that worked on my specific weak points, which I had to figure out over time, which were wide grip pull-ups, chin-ups, and standard neutral grip pull-ups, rotating between these 3 variations over a long enough time frame has enabled me to go from barely being able to get my chin over the bar to now repping out 100 pounds attached to me. And you can see this documented all through my Instagram profile. Another example would be with my deadlift. Before I knew how to select the correct variations that would actually help me to progress on my hinge movement pattern, I was stuck with a 3-plate deadlift for literally years until I found 3 fantastic variations, which for me fixed my specific weak points that were holding back my hinge movement pattern. And those variations, they might work for me. They might be completely different for you because you probably have completely different weak points than I do. My client Ollie was stuck at 90 kilos on bench press for 18 months. Think about how long that was. 18 months lifting the exact same weight on the bar. In 8 weeks of working with me, we got him to 100 kilos, a lifetime PR that he had never ever been able to even touch in the past. And this is just through applying his effort that he was already bringing to the gym to a system that actually made that result inevitable for him. Now, when you set up the IP method correctly for each of the 6 fundamental movement patterns, and you have selected variations for each one that first of all expose the weak points that you have, that fix those weak points at the same time, and you are cycling between variations, continually stimulating those muscle groups, continually progressing that fundamental movement pattern, bro, your strength level, your physique development is untapped. Because think of it this way, if you didn't have any weak points, if there was nothing to hold back your progression at the fundamental movement pattern level, then what would get in the way? What specifically is going to stop your physique from developing? What is stopping you from making steroid level progress? Now, if you want me to show you exactly how to apply this method to your training specifically, if you want me to take care of this entire process for you on your behalf, so that all that you need to do is just show up to the gym and execute on what's in front of you, the very first link in the description is going to be a link to book a call with me where we can discuss exactly how that will work. And if it makes sense for us to work together, we can do exactly that too. Like I say, that's the first link in the description. I'll look forward to speaking to you on the other side and have a good rest of your day.